In a world where perceptions often overshadow reality, we find ourselves drawn to stories that challenge our assumptions. Today's narrative centers around Malcolm Harper, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering dedication redefine what it means to be a hero. As you watch, prepare to journey through moments of misunderstanding, resilience, and ultimate vindication. This is not just a story about graduation day, it's about discovering the profound impact of silent sacrifices and unspoken love. Stay with us as we unfold how one man's actions transformed perceptions and revealed true greatness. The late afternoon sun poured golden light through the high windows of the university auditorium, casting long shadows across polished floors and ivory linen-covered tables. It was graduation day, an occasion meant for celebration, closure, and new beginnings. Yet for Lena Harper, this joy was laced with tension. She walked slowly through the reception hall, her diploma in hand, black heels tapping softly beside a pair of well-worn dress shoes. Beside her stood Malcolm Harper, her stepfather, a quiet man in his late 40s. His deep brown skin contrasted sharply with the pale sea of white faces around them. Malcolm wore a slightly faded navy blazer and khaki slacks, the tie she had helped him pick out that morning sitting a little askew. There was no flash to his presence, but there was warmth in how he looked at her, a pride that needed no words. Lena adjusted the gold tassel on her cap. Her posture was straight, her eyes scanning the crowd, but she felt the shift in the air before she even saw them. Her mother's side of the family, the Crowleys, stood near the refreshment table, all pearls and posture, clutching glasses of sparkling cider like props in a play. Whispers began as soon as she approached, carried by the air straight to her ears. "Is that the driver she brought?" one voice snickered. "I heard he was just her stepfather, only married into the family." Another chimed in, "She could have brought someone respectable, at least." Lena's stomach tightened as she glanced at Malcolm. His expression hadn't changed, not a twitch, not a flinch. He looked straight ahead, as if the judgment wasn't directed at him, as if it slid off without reaching his skin. But Lena knew better. She saw the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly, how his hands remained in his pockets, fingers fidgeting. Her mother hadn't come again, another year, another excuse. This time, it was too far, though the flight from Connecticut was barely 2 hours. But Malcolm, he had driven 7 hours straight through the night, no complaint, no pause, just to be there. And yet here he was, treated like a shadow instead of a father. Lena stayed close to him, resisting the urge to snap back, to defend him, to say, "This man helped me survive my teenage years when my own mother gave up." Instead, she smiled tightly and moved to greet a professor, dragging Malcolm with her, not because she was ashamed but because she didn't trust herself not to cry. He didn't say anything about the looks, he never did. But as they passed a table where a Crowley cousin made a show of shifting her handbag to the far side of her chair, Lena's hand reached for his elbow, anchoring them together. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Because neither of them were going anywhere. As Lena navigated the crowded reception hall, the sound of polished, polite laughter drifted from one corner. This laughter, designed to fill silences without much meaning, masked the undercurrent of judgment that rippled through the gathering. For Lena, however, one sharp phrase cut through the noise like glass on tile: "I wonder what her real father would think." She froze mid-step, her grip tightening on the edge of a dessert plate just enough to make it creak. Her shoulders stiffened, and her breath caught. Malcolm, who had been silently admiring the graduation banner stretched across the stage, turned to her. He didn't ask what was wrong, he didn't need to. Gently, his calloused hand reached across the table and touched hers, grounding her. His touch was soft, light, like a bookmark slipping between pages, but it pulled her back to herself. Then came the memories, not in words but in snapshots that played behind her eyes like flickers of light. She was 10 years old again, standing on the edge of the school parking lot, her classmates pointing and laughing as Malcolm pulled up in an old rust-stained pickup with the passenger door that groaned every time it opened. The other parents drove shiny SUVs, wore tailored suits, and silk scarves. But Malcolm, he wore a uniform shirt with grease stains on the collar, his hands still marked from a long shift at the mechanic shop. "Is that your uncle?" one kid had snorted. "Looks more like a delivery guy." Lena remembered sliding into the seat without a word, staring at the floor. But Malcolm had just smiled, offered her a paper cup of hot chocolate, and said, "Tough day." He didn't need her to explain, he just knew. Over the years, there were science fair nights where their living room turned into chaos of wires and colored papers. Malcolm pored over instructions like a college student studying for finals, even though he'd never finished high school himself. He cheered louder than anyone when she won third place and then fixed her nightlight when they got home. She remembered the first time he read To Kill a Mockingbird to her, his voice soft, steady, careful not to skip any words, even when his eyes moved slowly across the page. He sat through violin recitals, even when she hit all the wrong notes, clapping like she'd just played Carnegie Hall. And then there was the moment that changed everything, her biological father leaving, one suitcase, one lie about needing space, one door that never opened again. Malcolm never said, "I'm sorry." He never said, "I'll try." He just showed up, the next morning, in the morning after that, and every day for the next 10 years. Parent-teacher conferences, dentist appointments, college tours, not once did he ask for anything in return. Now, back in the present, Lena's eyes burned. She blinked them clear, watching Malcolm now, his soft-spoken strength wrapped in a thrift store suit and unwavering dignity. He looked so out of place among the polished marble floors and champagne flutes, but to her, he had never looked more right. She slid her hand under his. "You okay?" she whispered. He gave her a small smile. "You're the one in heels," he said with a wink that made her laugh despite herself. The comment behind her still lingered in the air, bitter and sharp. But Lena let it go, not because it didn't hurt but because she suddenly knew that the people saying it didn't understand the meaning of real. She looked at Malcolm, and in her chest bloomed a truth she hadn't said aloud in years: he never needed a title to be a father. He just chose to be one. A hush fell over the university auditorium as the chancellor stepped up to the microphone, her voice echoing across the polished floor. "And now," she announced with ceremonious rhythm, "we begin our honorary recognitions." The audience straightened in their seats, cameras clicked, and murmurs filled the air. Lena sat near the front row, her posture upright but her heart thudding against her ribs. Her name hadn't been confirmed, but whispers had reached her over the past week, hints from a mentor, a congratulatory email worded a little too cryptically. Still, she didn't dare assume, not today. Behind her, the Crowley family had gathered like a private exhibit of wealth and white linen, pearls-pressed collars and condescension polished to a shine. Their eyes rarely left Malcolm, who stood near the back wall of the auditorium alone. He wasn't seated with them, he never was. He stood quietly, hands clasped in front of him, nodding politely to those who passed. His suit, though freshly pressed, was a little too large in the shoulders and slightly frayed at the cuffs. His shoes, well-worn but clean, were scuffed at the toes, a reminder of work done, not style-worn. One of Lena's cousins leaned in to whisper, her voice sharp and theatrical. "Maybe he's here to clean up after," she said, stifling a laugh behind her program. Another added, seriously, "Who shows up to graduation dressed like the maintenance crew?" Lena heard it all, every biting remark, but she didn't turn around. She didn't glare or correct. Instead, her hand rested gently over her lap, the other clutching the program just tight enough to leave faint creases. She looked back at Malcolm. He stood still, his eyes focused on the stage, not flinching, not reacting, because he had heard it too. He always did. The chancellor continued announcing names, each met with applause and flashes from camera phones. Behind Lena, the Crowleys clapped with polite enthusiasm, their eyes flickering toward Malcolm with every mention of a new donor, every scholarship attributed to a recognizable last name. But then, the mood in the auditorium shifted. The chancellor smiled wider, her voice warming. "There's one award today," she said, "that we did not announce in advance, a special recognition for extraordinary personal sacrifice, leadership through adversity, and lifelong commitment to community and family." Lena felt the hairs on her arms rise. The whispers behind her quieted. This individual has inspired not only their child, who graduated today with top honors, but countless others in our local outreach program, the chancellor continued. Their humility may have kept them from the spotlight, but today, we make sure they're seen. A beat of silence followed, then the Chancellor said the name, Malcolm Harper. Lena's mouth fell open, her eyes darting back toward Malcolm. For the first time that day, he looked stunned, his brows lifted, his eyes widened slightly, as if the sound of his own name didn't quite belong in that space. The Crowley row stiffened as one. Lena rose instinctively, clapping before anyone else. Her hands met with crisp, rhythmic applause, then others followed, row by row, the room rose. Students, faculty, strangers joined in. Only the Crowley family remained seated, frozen. Malcolm didn't move. It was as if he'd turned to stone. Lena stepped into the aisle, nodding toward him. Her smile trembled, but her eyes shone. Slowly, he took a step forward. The man they thought was there to clean up was now walking toward the center of the stage, where a metal plaque and a microphone waited. The whispers had stopped. Now, there was only awe. As the dean stepped up to the podium, adjusting the mic, she invited the audience to lean in closer, to absorb a story that had remained untold until this very moment. Phones slipped into pockets, chairs shifted slightly, and even the most distracted attendees sensed something unusual was unfolding. Lena, seated near the front, leaned forward with polite interest. Malcolm, meanwhile, stood in the shadows near the exit, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture neutral but his eyes fixed firmly on the dean. The dean began, her voice steady yet solemn, recounting an event nearly 12 years ago during rush hour when a bomb detonated in the lower tracks of the 7th Street subway station. Panic swept the platform as people were injured, many trapped, while most ran for safety. However, one man ran toward the smoke, a detail that immediately caught Lena's attention. The story sounded familiar, too familiar, yet she couldn't immediately place why. The dean continued, describing how this man, with no training, no weapon, and no thought of himself, pulled 8 passengers from the wreckage. He administered CPR, used his shirt to stop someone's bleeding, and disappeared without giving his name once emergency responders arrived. A soft gasp rose from somewhere in the audience, followed by someone muttering, "I remember that story." Lena's skin prickled with goosebumps as the memory unraveled in her mind, a news clip from years ago, a subway bombing. The term subway Samaritan had floated through headlines for weeks, yet no one had ever found the man. She turned slightly, glancing back toward Malcolm, who hadn't moved, but his jaw was tight. The dean pressed on, explaining that while he avoided press and never sought reward, when tracking donations made anonymously to the trauma center that treated those victims, we found a trail. And it led them to someone standing in this very room today. Lena's breath caught as murmurs of quiet awe spread through the audience. Some guests exchanged glances, some sat stone still. The dean looked up from her notes, locking eyes with someone in the back, and today, she said, her voice warming with emotion, "We're honored to finally put a name to the courage." She paused for effect, waiting for history. Lena's heart pounded, something inside her already knew, but her mind couldn't accept it. Couldn't she glance around? Her family was whispering again, but it wasn't mocking anymore, it was confusion, intrigue, a hint of unease. Then came the next words from the dean, which would change everything, Malcolm Harper. For a split second, it was as though the entire auditorium stopped breathing. Then came the gasps, quick, audible inhales, followed by a wave of camera flashes, the kind reserved for celebrity moments or breaking news. Lena blinked rapidly, her body turning automatically in her seat, eyes darting toward the back of the room. There he stood, still in that slightly oversized brown suit, still with those weathered shoes, still holding his hands in front of him like he didn't quite belong. Only now, all eyes were on him. The same people who had whispered and laughed, the ones who had mistaken him for a driver, a janitor, or worse, were frozen in their seats. Their faces displayed a spectrum of shock, jaws slightly agape, eyebrows raised, mouths trying to form words and failing. Even Lena's smug cousin, the one who joked about him cleaning up after, now stared at Malcolm like she'd seen a ghost wearing a name tag of honor. Malcolm didn't move right away. It took him a second to process the moment, a second to believe they really had called his name. Then, slowly and humbly, he began to walk, no swagger, no hurry, just steady, deliberate steps toward the stage. Lena felt her chest tighten, her throat closing with emotion, her eyes shimmering as she stood. She hadn't known, no one told her. She had been so sure she knew every reason to be proud of him, but this was something else entirely. People turned to look at her now as Malcolm walked. Some began clapping, then more, louder, until the entire room echoed with applause. Except for the Crowleys, who sat stiff and motionless, like a family portrait cracking at the frame. The Chancellor met Malcolm at the edge of the stage, placing a hand over her heart as she gestured for him to come forward. "Mr. Harper," she said into the microphone, her voice warm and reverent, "you are a quiet architect of change." As Malcolm ascended the stage, the Chancellor's voice resonated warmly, acknowledging him as a quiet architect of change. She highlighted his years mentoring students, volunteering for night classes, tutoring single parents, and funding programs anonymously through the Community Development Fund. With each accolade, the whispers in the audience grew softer, replaced by a collective awe. The applause swelled, a testament to unseen efforts finally being unveiled. Malcolm, however, didn't blink at the praise. His eyes were locked with Lena's, who smiled through tears, hands clasped in front of her as if holding the moment with her own strength. Taking the microphone, Malcolm surveyed the crowd, hundreds of faces, some cheering, some ashamed, some stunned into stillness. He cleared his throat and began, "I wasn't expecting this. I didn't do any of that for recognition. I did it because someone once did it for me." The auditorium went silent, absorbing the weight of his words. He continued, glancing briefly at Lena, "My stepdaughter is the most brilliant person I know, and I knew long before anyone else that she'd make it, not because of her grades or awards, but because she gets back up every time life tries to knock her down." A few sniffles rose from the crowd, and even the photographers paused. "I'm not her biological father," Malcolm confessed, his voice gentle yet firm. "But when her dad walked away, I knew that little girl needed someone who would stay. That's all I ever tried to do, stay, support, and let her know she was never alone." A palpable stillness enveloped the room, born of the profound truth he had spoken. Malcolm looked down at the award in his hand, an engraved glass plaque bearing his name, and shook his head as if he still didn't quite believe it. "I didn't think people noticed," he admitted softly, "but I guess they do." Stepping away from the mic, he offered a quiet nod of gratitude. The applause that followed was louder than before, longer, fuller, and more meaningful. Back at her table, Lena stood with trembling hands, not from shock, but from pride so overwhelming it made her feel taller. She didn't care about the stares anymore, not when the whole room had just seen who he really was. The man they had mocked for being just a stepfather was now standing where heroes belong, at the front, under the lights, with his story finally told. There was a moment, just a breath, when the entire auditorium seemed to stand still. Then, from the back of the room, Malcolm Harper stepped forward. No longer the invisible man by the wall, no longer just the quiet stepfather in an old blazer, all eyes followed him now. Yet he walked with the same calm, humble stride Lena had known her whole life. As he reached the stage, even the dean appeared momentarily overwhelmed, offering him the microphone with both hands, her eyes shining with respect and admiration. Malcolm took the mic slowly, glancing at the sea of faces. Many looked stunned, some embarrassed, and a few were already tearing up. His voice, when it came, was gentle, not grandiose, not theatrical. "I don't usually speak in front of crowds," he began, offering a small, self-conscious smile. "I never planned to, and I never planned on what happened that day in the subway either." He paused, letting his words settle, then continued with quiet clarity. "I was just heading home from work. I heard the blast, saw the smoke, and I ran toward it. I didn't think, I didn't pray, I just moved." His hands trembled slightly, but he kept going, his voice steady. "I saw a boy stuck under rubble, a woman who couldn't breathe, and I remember thinking, if I don't help, who will?" The room was utterly silent, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "I never wanted recognition," he continued. "I didn't think what I did was heroic. I thought it was human." He looked down, then glanced up again, his gaze searching until it landed squarely on Lena. "But if there's one thing I'm proud of, truly proud of, it's not what happened that day. He paused, drawing a deep breath. It's raising Lena. Lena's breath hitched, her eyes burning with emotion. Malcolm's voice softened further as he said, she isn't my blood, but she's my heart. I was there when her father left. I was there for the nightmares, the violin recital, the breakups, the late-night study sessions. I didn't do it for a thank you. I did it because loving her gave my life meaning. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. She was my reason to keep going, and today, seeing her graduate, seeing her shine, I know I did something right. Unable to remain seated, Lena stood, her hands clapping, lips trembling, and eyes glassy with pride. The sound of her applause echoed, and then, like a wave, others joined in, one by one, the entire auditorium rising to their feet. Even the relatives who once rolled their eyes, even the guests who had whispered behind his back, now stood in unison. Malcolm lowered the mic, gave a small nod, and stepped down. But in that moment, he wasn't the man in the weathered suit. He was the hero, the father, the man who showed the world what integrity looked like in action. The air outside the auditorium felt different, not because the sun had shifted or the breeze had picked up, but because something profound had shifted within the room itself. Years of unspoken assumptions, smug grins, and backhanded remarks had collapsed beneath the weight of a single truth, spoken plainly into a microphone. As Malcolm descended the steps with quiet dignity, returning to Lena's side, her arms wrapped around him tightly. It wasn't a dramatic gesture but one imbued with meaning, as if to say, I see you now more than ever. Inside the reception hall, the mood had turned uneasy. The Crowley family, once positioned like royalty with their flutes of champagne and pearls of condescension, now seemed smaller somehow. Their laughter had vanished, their posture had changed, and whispers were replaced by silence. A few approached slowly, awkwardly. Her Aunt Carol, always the first to judge and the last to listen, stumbled through an opening line. We didn't realize, a younger cousin, who earlier had chuckled about Malcolm's shoes, offered a half-hearted nod. I didn't know, he mumbled, eyes glued to the floor. Malcolm looked at him, not coldly, but without a trace of apology. You didn't ask, he replied, his voice steady. There was no need for cruelty, no need for vindication, just the truth, offered simply. The same cousin swallowed hard and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No one had much else to say after that. Malcolm turned to Lena, who didn't need to speak. The pride in her expression was louder than any toast. They walked together past the marble columns, past the stunned faces, past the people who had once labeled him the help or mistaken him for a driver. Malcolm's steps were light, Lena's hand looped through his arm. Neither of them looked back. There were no more whispers that followed, only silence and the fading sound of their footsteps as they left the hall with their heads held high. In that quiet, even the judgmental learn something, that true greatness doesn't raise its voice. It walks beside you unnoticed until the moment you can no longer ignore it. Back in their modest home, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting soft golden rays across the wooden floor. The air still smelled faintly of fresh flowers, remnants from the bouquet Lena had been handed after the ceremony. On the kitchen counter, half a chocolate cake sat untouched, the kind Malcolm always picked up when there was something to celebrate, even if it was just making it through a tough week. Lena stood before the refrigerator, holding two frames. One was a drawing she had made in third grade, crayon lines sketching out a crooked house with a tall stick figure labeled My Hero Malcolm. It had hung there for years, slightly curled at the edges, its tape yellowing. The other frame was new, a glossy photo freshly printed of Malcolm standing on stage, medal around his neck, spotlight on his face, applause frozen mid-motion behind him. She paused, not out of hesitation but reverence. With care, Lena removed the old drawing and tucked it gently into a memory box on the shelf. Then, she placed the new photo in its spot, center stage on the fridge door. It was a quiet elevation, a subtle coronation. She stepped back, and for the first time in years, there was nothing more to prove, not to her mother's side of the family, not to classmates, not to anyone. Malcolm walked in, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He looked at the fridge and then at her. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. I know, Lena replied, her voice thick with emotion. But I wanted the world to see what I've always seen. They sat together in the living room, the silence between them warm and full. Outside, children laughed in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed, and a dog barked at a squirrel. Life in its ordinary rhythm played on, and yet something had fundamentally changed. Now, the world knew what Lena had always carried in her heart, that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare. It doesn't wear medals on its chest every day. Instead, it wears calloused hands, a quiet voice, a steady presence through violin recitals and broken science projects, and long nights of doubt. It wears the face of a man who never asked to be seen but finally was. Heroism doesn't always wear a cape or come with a pedigree. Sometimes, it shows up every day, uncelebrated, until the world finally sees what was always there. In the aftermath of the ceremony, as Malcolm Harper returned home with Lena, the significance of the day's revelations settled over their modest household like a comforting blanket. The transformation in public perception was palpable, yet Malcolm's demeanor remained unchanged. He had never sought recognition, and his daily routine continued with the same quiet dedication that had characterized his life thus far. However, the ripple effects of his acknowledgement were undeniable. The narrative of his life, previously hidden in the shadows of societal assumptions, had emerged into the light, reshaping views on what constitutes true heroism and familial bonds. Malcolm's story serves as a powerful reminder that heroism is not confined to grand gestures or public acclaim. It thrives in the quiet corners of everyday life, through acts of kindness, steadfast support, and unconditional love. His journey from a misunderstood figure to a celebrated hero underscores the importance of looking beyond appearances and titles. It challenges us to recognize the value of individuals who might otherwise be overlooked, urging society to appreciate the profound impact of consistent, understated contributions. Moreover, Malcolm's relationship with Lena exemplifies a deeper understanding of family dynamics. It dispels the notion that parental roles are defined solely by biology, highlighting instead the power of choice and commitment. His unwavering presence in Lena's life, through every triumph and tribulation, redefines what it means to be a parent. This narrative invites viewers to reconsider their own biases and preconceived notions about family structures, encouraging a broader acceptance of diverse familial relationships based on love and dedication rather than traditional norms. Reflecting on Malcolm Harper's life and the events of that transformative day, we are reminded of the enduring power of integrity and the quiet strength that shapes lives in ways we might not immediately perceive. His story is not just one of personal achievement but a beacon calling for a societal shift towards valuing the unseen and celebrating the unsung heroes among us. In recognizing these qualities, we enrich our communities and foster a culture that cherishes genuine human connection and contribution above superficial markers of success. Thus, Malcolm's legacy continues to inspire, urging each of us to seek out and appreciate the silent architects of change in our own lives.